It is 1:01 by my clock. And over 100 participants. I think you should just let me know. You get to.
Let me just, let's give it one more minute and then we should get started.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Why am I so red? Are there any lighting people in this chat?
You look beautiful, Mike.
I am under quarantine.
I think mostly we're looking at slides, so it will be fine.
Okay. You guys have the positive good lighting. I'll have the harsh negative lessons learned lighting.
The light in front of you. You want the light on your face, not behind you, because it's a window behind you.
So Felicia, I say we get started just in the interest of time, and then yeah.
Great. So hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am very pleased to be able to work with my colleagues, of course, at the Roosevelt Institute. Oh, I'm Felicia Wong. I run the Roosevelt Institute, and I'm very grateful to be able to work with my colleagues at Roosevelt and with colleagues at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and the Groundwork Collaborative in putting together a webinar that's really designed to help folks across the progressive movement make sense of the moment, make sense of what's happening in the economy, which we've seen really struggle and in fact start to go off a very significant demand cliff as a result of the coronavirus crisis. Oh, actually, let me pause for a second. Can you hear me? Someone should just let me know, because I've been told that sometimes I am difficult to hear on Zoom calls. Okay, great, terrific. I'm seeing chat saying we hear you. Okay, great, thank you. So just a couple things to set it up. First of all, yes, we are going to try to have a conversation about how to make sense of this moment. I just wanted to say two things in kicking this off. First of all, I think it's important to note that one of the great things we've seen in this moment is that there have been many economic responses across the progressive movement, across both parties, across many different legislators have immediately said, yes, this is a very, very, very serious economic moment. We need to do a lot to make sure that is not trading off different kinds of economic responses. We've seen calls for cash, which are incredibly important. We've seen calls for unemployment insurance, incredibly important. We've seen calls for helping small business, incredibly important. One of the things we want to make sure that to be able to do all of these things, that's going to take a lot of political will and a lot of political linking of arms. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I'll say, and my colleagues Mike, Michael, and Heather will say more about this, this is actually something that we can afford to do. This is not a time when we need to be worried about the costs of action. In fact, the costs of inaction are far graver. So this is our response should be sustained, structural, and not targeted and temporary. So that's a really important thing for everyone to understand. This is a consensus now across most economists who have begun working on solutions to this set of problems. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to my colleague, Heather Boucher, who runs the Center for Equitable Growth. She is going to be talking about the kind of macroeconomics of this moment. She will then hand the mic or the baton to Michael Linden, who runs the Groundwork Collaborative. He'll talk about the gravity and the scale of the demand shortfall that we are seeing. And then finally, Michael Linden will turn it to Mike Conzel, my colleague at the Roosevelt Institute. Mike will talk about some of the policy solutions that are beginning to emerge, and why we need to make sure that we take the right lessons and not the wrong lessons from the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. So, and then we'll take some Q&A and close it out. But for now, I'm going to turn the mic over to Heather.
Great. Thank you, Felicia. I've got the chat up. Can people let me know if they can, if you can't hear me? I am not on mute, so I know at least I've got that sorted. So I'm very happy to that so many folks have joined this call today. I'm really happy to partner with the other organizations on the call. Thank you so much, Felicia, for opening us up. It's been great to work with Roosevelt and Groundwork to put this together. So my job here is to talk for just a few minutes about the current state of the economy and what is happening. Let me, and I think Katie is doing the slides, and somebody let me know if that's not the right name, but I think we want to go to the next slide. Yeah, just, okay, no, there you go. Okay, great. So I want to start by noting that this recession is very different from the last two, in that it is not starting because of a collapse in an asset bubble, but is starting because of a health crisis. And there are some really important, I am not audible, it's saying. Can folks hear me? I'm going to pause for a moment. Yes, some folks can hear me, some can't. Okay, so let me just, okay, yes, all right, there's lots. Okay, great. This is distracting. So let me start by saying again that this, what we're seeing in the economy is very different than the last two economic crises, because those were started by the collapse of a asset bubble. You're going too fast on the slides, by the way, Katie. The collapse of an asset bubble in equities in the case of the 2001 recession, and of course the collapse of the housing bubble and the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. This is being started by a health crisis that means that we are, that policymakers need people to stop engaging in the economy so that we can stop the spread of this virus. So while some of the economic outcomes are going to look the same and some of the policy recommendations are going to be the same, we need to note that some will be very different, because part of what's happening is that the ongoing fragilities in our economy caused by economic inequality, the fact that the United States is the only country that doesn't give everyone access to healthcare, the fact that the United States stands alone among our economic competitors in not giving people access to paid sick days or paid family leave, the fact that we have a very weak social insurance system is all going to exacerbate this crisis relative to other countries and is making it worse. Both the health crisis, which is then magnifying into an economic crisis. So, and that's going to be a theme of a lot of different things that all of us are going to talk about today, but just wanted to start by noting that fact. And happy to come back to that in Q&A as well. So what we're seeing, of course, is a very sharp drop in demand and supply shortages. And these are driven by the fact that we've told people to go home. right? I mean, we're doing a Zoom call rather than an in-person event because we're all telecommuting. We've all been told to, I feel like it's social isolation, but I know we're supposed to call it social distancing, and not be in workplaces and not engage in the same way in the economy as we normally do. So that's leading to a sharp drop in consumer spending. It's hitting especially, I mean, all sorts of firms, but it's hitting travel-related industries. It's hitting small businesses especially hard as demand is just drying up. And, you know, we know that at the same time, we're seeing supply shortages because folks can't go to work or they shouldn't go to work or people are sick. And so that's causing shortages across the supply chain. It started, of course, a couple months ago as because of the crisis, the health crisis in China, the very intricate supply chains that the United States now has were disrupted. And that was one of the first signs of this crisis. One of the things to really bear in mind is that we need to make sure that we have people that are able to get to their jobs in especially healthcare and other sectors, but also in producing goods for the healthcare industry. And this is something that's going to come up in the policy conversation time and time again. So let me go to the next slide. I'm going to show you a few charts. This is going to be a total downer, and it's going to seem very scary because a lot of what we are starting to see now in terms of the data are numbers that we've never seen before, because we've never had a crisis like this before, where you know, as of yesterday, the largest state in the country told people to just stay home. So that, of course, has these reverberating economic effects. So if you can go to the next slide. What we are seeing, this is the percent change in total hours worked by hourly employees in the United States. This is going back, this is day-by-day data from, actually, I won't go into the source, but day-by-day data, and you can see this sharp drop in total hours worked by hourly employees. Can you please move the slide forward? Next slide. Hello?
Hi, what slide is everyone seeing? A stagnating?
We should be seeing the slide saying the entire country is feeling the effects, the first graphic, and we're all seeing the one before that.
Okay, there we go. The entire country is feeling, there we go.
Still not seeing it.
So there may be some glitches with Zoom right now. I'm getting a number of different things. On my screen, it says the entire country is feeling the effects. You all don't see that?
No. So, okay, but I can just draw the chart. It's actually quite easy. There's a horizontal bar, and then there's the number of hours, which is just the changes in hours, which is pretty much the same. And then it just plummets over the last few days. So the percent change in total hours worked by employees in the United States is down by 32% relative to the same weekdays in January. So it's no change, just normal, plummeting by a third. The next slide is very similar in that it's looking at the entire country, but it is looking at again, fewer employees are going to work in the United States even before the forced closures. So we will go to the next slide, which you all can't see, but I'm just drawing them. So the next one that I really want to focus on here is that there has been a very, very sharp rise in unemployment insurance claims. So what we see normally in terms of the number of people who are applying for unemployment insurance is that it had been hovering at around 200,000 people, a little over 200,000 people per week. That spiked to about 630,000 last week. And that is the largest one-week spike we've ever seen. And that is, of course, because we told all of these Americans to go home. All of these businesses have closed their doors. And the best thing for those employees is that they get unemployment insurance so that they can still have their income, pay their rent, buy food, and all the things. So on the one hand, this is a scary statistic that we're seeing this sharp rise in unemployment insurance. But this is absolutely an economic imperative. So I actually see this statistic as great news Because if you're going to tell everybody to stay home, what you want to make sure is that people are still made whole. And so the fact that so many folks are applying for UI means that there's a lot of folks that are claiming UI, a lot of folks are getting that benefit. The problem, of course, is that the UI systems in the states, of course, this is a state-run system, are quickly being overwhelmed and have never had to deal with so much capacity so quickly. So I think there are a lot of concerns as to whether or not they're going to be able to get benefits out. And I will note, and this will come up in a moment, in our UI system is not strong enough, especially after the Great Recession. Only about a quarter of the unemployed were receiving unemployment insurance benefits before this recession, and we need that to be 100%. And we need folks to be getting, I would argue, 100% of their pay during this health crisis.
Hey, Heather, just so
Yeah.
you know, the slides are now working. We're
Yep.
on the slide that says a staggering rise in unemployment claims in 1
Yep.
week. You're back.
Yeah, got it. So, so that's the chart that I just described. So let me go through the next few. So I want to spend a couple of moments talking about the potential magnitude. So the next one here, the next slide, let's go to it quickly before Zoom. So go one more slide, please. Wonderful. So this is a figure to just give you a sense of the states that have had the largest percentage increase in claims for the unemployment insurance system. You can see clearly that they are Washington State and Nevada and Massachusetts, followed by Maryland and Connecticut. Certainly Washington, my home state, the visual behind you is from the San Juan Islands in Washington State, was hard hit first. With all of those deaths coming out of the assisted living facility, and then of course Nevada, which is just all about tourism, seeing those claims rise sharply early on. So this is how we're going to see this playing out across the country. I think one thing to watch is whether or not states that have more robust unemployment insurance systems are able to better weather this this challenge. That's something that we as researchers will be looking to in the days and weeks to come. Let me go to the next slide. One of the things that we know, next slide. Okay. Okay, great. So this is the same data. If you go back to the map, it's a similar. Well, okay, Zoom is grumpy. I guess everybody in America is on a conference call right now. But this just gives you a visual of that data, so you can clearly see that those states that were hit hard earliest have had this very, very sharp rise in claims. So go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the things that we know about this crisis, because again, I can't stress this enough, this is a healthcare crisis that because of the ongoing fragilities in our economic systems, because we don't take care of people who are sick, and because we make them, especially low-wage workers and workers in service, we as a nation have not given them access to paid sick days. That means that we have embedded this fragility and exacerbated this health crisis into a much larger economic crisis. The slide that you can see in front of you underscores that services are, of course, being hit especially hard. And of course, many restaurant workers, I should have looked up the number before I got on this call, in the United States, don't have, traditionally have not had access to paid sick days, much lower, of course, than our economic competitors that here are looking just at restaurant performance in Germany and the UK. You can see that the US is seeing a sharper dip. The legislation that was passed by Congress last week or this week does give some folks access to paid sick, but not everyone. And there are carve-outs for large businesses. This is one of the urgent economic issues we need to solve. Although with so many people home, that ship may have sailed, and all those sick people have already infected everyone. So there you go. Sorry, it's very dark. I'm trying to gallows humor. Let me go to the next slide here, which is the final slide, I believe, in my, no, I have three more in my section here. So this is very important. So as you see economic activity stopping because of the health crisis, that means that state and local governments are going to see their tax revenues collapse. Now, of course, the federal government has the capacity to run deficits in ways that state and local governments just do not. And so that's going to mean that states are going to be very strapped for resources. And of course, if I'm not mistaken, I'm sure there's someone from the Center on Budget on this call. My understanding, about a quarter of state revenues on average come from sales taxes, and with such a sharp decline in economic activity, that's going to lead to a sharp drop in revenues. The extent to which the federal government doesn't make states whole or help them, that could actually, again, exacerbate the economic crisis, because if states feel at all any pressure to cut back on things that, especially that support people and families through these hard times, all of that will magnify and exacerbate the crisis. So this is something to watch. During the Great Recession, we did not do a good enough job supporting state and local governments, and that's had a decade-long effect in terms of some of the long-term outcomes. Again, we could do a whole seminar on that, but let me go on to the last the last two slides here. So the next slide is that, and this I'm going to leave to other folks. This is like the theme, sort of setting up the next two, Michael and Mike. The big question here that everyone is asking is, how long will this last? I think that the first answer starts with how quickly we can address the health crisis. We all can't go back to work. The economy cannot get back on its feet until we have free and available testing, until we have a vaccine, but until we have a healthcare system that can make sure that people who are sick are not actively engaging in the economy. So that is a very important piece of the puzzle. And the extent to which policymakers can keep folks whole, keep state governments whole, keep families whole, keep small businesses whole through this crisis, that will mitigate the long-term economic effects. This crisis does not need to have long-term effects if we could solve the healthcare issues and keep people whole until we can all get back to work. But of course, we've been acting, the administration has been acting far too slowly, and the choices that they've been making have not been as big or as fast as we need. So I want to end here on this slide. Again, I feel like they just assigned me this massive doom and gloom section. One of the real rough things about the Great Recession was that it had a long-term effect on the life chances, the life economic opportunities for those who had graduated into that recession. And now, just a decade later, those folks who are still struggling with issues around student debt, still trying to get their foothold in the economy, are going to be hit by being hit by this next economic crisis. You think of all of those students who are graduating this spring, who are going into a job market that literally doesn't exist. There are going to be long-term human tolls from this. So on that positive and upbeat note, I believe I've gone over my time a little, and I'm going to hand the baton off to Michael Linden. Thank you all very much for not dropping off the call, and I hope you all could hear and see. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I'm going to try to start my video, but the host has stopped it, which is probably wise, frankly. So what I want to do in this section is basically talk about, I want to talk about, oh, there we go. Hi, everyone. So Heather gave us a good introduction for how all the economic damage that is likely to come from this crisis. And what I want to do is leave you with the understanding that our economy was already quite vulnerable to a crisis of this type. And many of the policies and procedures and choices that we've made over the last many years, but even in the last few years under the Trump administration, are likely to make it harder for us to respond to this crisis, to make the crisis worse, and make the recession deeper and more painful than it had to be. And the thing is, it's really important that we internalize this so that we don't fail to learn the lessons from this, so we don't fail to learn lessons from this crisis. So I'm going to take you through a couple of these examples, but there are more. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll try to be relatively quick here. So I'm going to talk about 5 different ways in which there were existing vulnerabilities that have made us less resilient and are going to exacerbate this crisis. One, we've got enormous inequality that's been supercharged by the Trump administration. We do not have enough social supports. We don't have national paid sick leave or national paid family leave. Heather already mentioned this, but our unemployment insurance system is weaker than it should be. We also have a very consumer-driven economy, which is heavily reliant on the service sector, and that is an area that is going to be uniquely affected by this crisis. And we do not, and those are also the workers who have the fewest protections. We have allowed and actually encouraged corporations to run up large levels of debt even while they're buying back stock, and now they're coming with their hand out for bailouts. And of course, there is a unique precarity for marginalized communities. Communities of color, especially Black workers, are often the last in and first out in crises like this, and that's going to have reverberating effects for all of us. So let's just quickly go through these. Next slide. This graph just is a chart I'm sure many of you have seen. The United States has record levels of income and wealth inequality. But the important thing to understand, which of course is a moral failing, but what's important to understand in this context is that income inequality and wealth inequality have made us less stable, has made the economy less stable and more vulnerable to shocks like these. When most Americans don't have $400 in savings and then they get laid off or they get their hours reduced, they are going to reduce their demand, and they are going to have spillover effects to everybody else in their community. And that's what's happening right now. So tax cuts for the wealthy that we passed, not us, not people on this call, mostly the people on this call vigorously opposed those tax cuts. But the tax cuts that were passed a few years ago, are contributing to this. The corporations use their money for buybacks. We're going to talk about this in a little bit. And income inequality likely rose. And instead of supporting people at the bottom in the middle, more and more money went to the top. That's going to make us uniquely vulnerable. Next slide. It's important to remember here that not everyone recovered from the last Great Recession. There were many people who are only just getting back to what was quote unquote normal. Many people have not recovered at all. Black household wealth is still the same level or lower than it was before the Great Recession began. So we can't expect people to fall back on their own personal safety net because we haven't invested in regular people. Next slide. So a second major vulnerability for all of us here is that we simply as a society, as an economy, have not done the public interventions in the economy that we should have to make a crisis like this less painful. No paid sick leave, millions of people without health insurance coverage, unemployment insurance system is not strong enough to handle the rapid demand. So these are policy choices. These are policies that I think many of us on this call have been advocating for in, quote unquote, normal times. But what this crisis is showing is how important these things are, especially in emergencies, and why they are smart economic policies and not just moral or just policies. Next slide. So Heather mentioned this and showed a graph of the restaurant industry. Obviously, this is a sector that is uniquely harmed in this exact moment, and it will have spillover effects to everyone else. And it's worth understanding that choices that we've made in terms of policies, sort of conservative or neoliberal economic policies, have made the workers in these industries uniquely vulnerable. Tipped minimum wage is heavily concentrated in these kinds of sectors. These are sectors that are disproportionately women and women of color, and which means there's an enormous wage gap in these sectors. So what we've done is we've got a crisis that is uniquely hitting people who are already quite vulnerable, and we've done nothing to prepare them or the wider economy for that vulnerability. And in fact, you could argue that we've done a lot of things to make that much worse. Next slide. Okay, so we've done three underlying vulnerabilities: income inequality, a lack of public investment in core social safety net features, the unique vulnerability of the service sector. This is a fourth one. This is, the people much smarter and more attuned to the financial sector than me have been screaming about this for years, that we have had massive run up in corporate debt since the end of the Great Recession. The Trump administration has pulled back on regulations and rules that were put in place under the Obama administration that were trying to manage this and put in protections. So this is a point that is uniquely specific to the Trump administration. We should not allow them to avoid this. And many folks said, well, this amount of debt, what happens when there's a drop in demand? What happens when these corporations can't service this debt? And we are seeing this right now play out with the Fed having to inject massive amounts of liquidity into the financial markets, and these industries coming to Congress and to the Trump administration saying, bail us out. This is not a random effect. This is not just a natural thing that happened. These were choices that these were both policy and industry choices that were made, and we have to make sure that we emphasize that. Next slide. I want to close on the unique precarity for marginalized communities. I've mentioned this a little bit already, and I want to really highlight it. In an economy where Black and Latino households have much less wealth, have much less of a sort of personal safety net to fall back on, we should expect that those communities will bear the brunt of the downturn. The unemployment rate among Black households is usually about twice that of everyone else, and we should, again, my guess is that will start to spike again. That is not just a problem for those communities, although of course it absolutely is. It has spillover and spiraling effects for everyone. And we have made choices in this country to make these problems much worse. So the next slide. Thank you, Katie. Oh, there's the unemployment rate. I forgot that was in there. And then the next slide. Okay, so before I turn it over to Mike, that was my last slide. I will just reiterate the core point here that this is a unique crisis. Of course, coronavirus and the public health crisis is something that we are appropriately focused on, but it is coming into a system based on choices that we have made that has made us more vulnerable and has made the crisis much worse than it had to be, and is likely to make the recession that follows it much deeper and harder to combat. And we have to ensure that we are telling that story as much as we are telling the story of where are the tests and how come people are paying out of pocket for health insurance coverage and all of the other public health concerns. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's going to talk through what we should do in this moment.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Can I get a thumbs up? Oh, excellent. Thank you, everyone. And Katie or someone, if you want to kick me, I can put on video. I don't have the ability to do that this second. But yeah, so if we get the next slide. All right, so in general, the Federal Reserve or the federal government can push on kind of two avenues. One is monetary policy, which is what the Federal Reserve does. It has largely taken The actions it has taken essentially on Sunday was equivalent to basically what happened during the Great Recession, to give you a sense of the scale and severity and speed at which things are moving. So it lowered interest rates to 0%. It put in a bunch of lending facilities for the banks. We'll have a long conversation in the months and years ahead about the fairness and equitableness of it. But for right now, it seemed pretty necessary to prevent a meltdown, as the economy will have a 1/4 drop, probably equivalent to some of the worst we saw in the Great Depression. Fiscal policy, as you know, that we're in a third round of bills being proposed and passed in Congress. This one will probably be the one that has the most spending involved with it, one that will be the most traditionally fiscal package. The government can spend in this recession. It can spend on a variety of mechanisms. One is that it can essentially run an industrial policy to try to fight the virus. That involves making sure ventilators and masks and healthcare professionals have the resources, are available and have the resources they need. We're not going to talk specifically about that. That's a very separate conversation. We absolutely have the money to do that. That's less of a fiscal challenge and much more of a managerial and planning challenge, which I hope we are up to. On the question of the overall economy while we are in lockdown and quarantine, we absolutely do have the tools that we need to be able to tackle this. Can I see the next slide? Sure. So as I said, this is a health crisis first, and we need to make sure that we're putting in the planning necessary to get tests, to get the resources, to get people where they need to be. On the economic front, which I'm going to focus on here, I think there's a couple really key things we can learn from the Great Recession that followed the 2008 financial crisis. And one, and I think this is the key one we want to emphasize, and I think everyone wants to emphasize, is that the risk is that we're going to do too little rather than we do too much. What are reasons we might do too little? If we could go back a slide. Reasons we might do too little is because we are worried about the debt and deficit. But right now, interest rates have fallen dramatically. The ability of the federal government to take on loans and debt to address this crisis is really unprecedented. It is very common for economists, a very conservative economist named Kenneth Rogoff, who was very critical of actions in the Great Recession, recently just casually dropped $5 trillion as a total kind of cost we might be looking to take on within the United States. Our own estimates inside the Roosevelt Institute say we should be thinking between at least $2 and $3 trillion in the average case scenario. 1 trillion goes up to 10 is really scary. 1 trillion should not be something that scares you in this moment. Financial markets are crying out for government action. The ones who are also going to get hurt along with everyday people. Long-term interest rates are negative, which means essentially the private market is willing to pay the US government to take action. So if anyone's worried about the debt or deficit, we absolutely have the tools and the bandwidth. It is not an obstacle to what we have. Another reason we might not take right action is because lagging indicators. I think we're in better shape to appreciate this because it is happening so quick. So this is less of a worry than I thought a few days ago. As Heather showed you, unemployment numbers are coming in. State governors are particularly focused on it. We are very aware of how quickly this is going to come. But even then, if we think unemployment might go up 3%, which is much larger. We've only had 1 month where unemployment went up more than 1% in 60 years. Unemployment going to 3 or 4%, it might actually go up 5 or 6%. We won't know it for a little bit until it's readjusted. So, even if we're prepared for bad, it could be far worse than we imagined. And it's really important to plan for that bad case scenario. And another thing is who gets what kinds of, what are the consequences of who gets help? It is very easy to imagine a scenario in which we do 1 or 2 things and maybe even do them well, but it doesn't have the scope and the breadth necessary to really address our crisis. We might be able to help people, but then states are going to get screwed over and have to cut services, which has huge implications for public health. We might be able to help states, but we don't necessarily help small businesses. We help big corporations, but we don't necessarily help people who are losing their jobs. So it's in the same way that debt is not a constraint on us, the constraint that I just described, not being able to do enough, is entirely a political one. We have institutions in place, such as unemployment insurance, the ability to aid states, the ability to write checks. The government's very good at writing checks to small local businesses. We have the ability. The only real question is our political ability to carry it out. So the policy choices matter quite a bit. And if we screw this up, it really does harm our ability to argue that programs should be expanded, which I think many people here believe that. As Michael was saying, this reflects a lot of the insecurity and precarity that everyday people were experiencing. It's now been amplified quite dramatically when we need to rely on paid leave or unemployment insurance in a much more profound way than we normally do in our day-to-day lives. And there's a way in which the fact that this virus is not it is very alien to us. There's a chance that this could bring us together, but if we botch how these programs are executed and don't give people a good template to learn from and experience and say this is worthwhile, then it really harms our ability to advocate for them in the future. Can you see the next slide? So what are, there's, as I said, there's many fronts. Obviously address health needs. And the specifics of what needs to be done there is not in this conversation, but the more we can do, the better and quickly, because any amount of effort there, if it can knock a week off the crisis, will pay for itself 1,000 times over. And I'm not even probably exaggerating on that amount. What can we do? Well, social insurance is a cool thing. Social insurance insures against lost wages. That's what unemployment insurance does. Is if you lose your job, it helps make you whole. So keeping people whole, making sure that cash goes out to people who lost their jobs. Our unemployment system is incredibly spotty. A lot of people don't benefit from it. A lot of people in the way the economy is fissured, so you no longer necessarily legally work for your employer. You work for a third-party contractor, or you yourself are a contractor, and thus do not get the benefits of things like unemployment insurance. We can just expand it right now with a few sentences in a bill. We can much greatly expand using already existing infrastructure to get unemployment insurance to more people who are going to lose their jobs. We can also get checks directly to people. Many people don't work. Many people can't work. Maybe they're disabled. Maybe they're caregiving. Maybe they're students. At which point unemployment insurance may not be the best mechanism for them, but we can just cut people checks. Cutting people checks in general might be very good for everyone, because we really do want to backstop the economy as a whole. We want to make sure people have money in their pockets to be able to pay for the essentials that are going on. Even though fewer people are going to work, a lot of people are still working. A lot of things are still happening, and there's still a lot of mechanisms in the background that keeping people whole and making sure they can meet balance sheet obligations. Firms can stay open. People can keep their lives going. Will have huge implications for the recovery. Providing money to states and municipalities. There's a lot of ways to do this quickly and cleanly that are very helpful, that crucially help states do the things they need to do. For instance, expanding the matching on Medicaid is a classic one. Expanding unemployment insurance, which is really going to hit states if we aren't careful and make sure that this happens. As opposed to the federal government, the states really do have fiscal considerations because they can't issue their own currency. People who did policy or even just lived through the Great Recession probably saw this in real time. And that has really big consequences, because the retrenchment that happens at the state and local level does not bounce back. A lot of those things that are closed do not come back, or they're privatized and sold off. And so the more we can backstop state and municipalities, I think the much better we are. And we have the ability to do that quickly and cleanly. And then, the UK actually just announced that it's going to investigate or maybe even execute paying 80% of the salaries for workers at all their businesses for the next 3 months, as long as there's no layoffs. And Denmark has done a similar thing. The UK is interesting because it's most like our country in the way it's structured as a welfare state. And the fact that they are taking on this very aggressive, almost sectoral bargaining style interjection into the labor market shows that we are not thinking at the level sufficient for what we need to do. Can I see the next slide? And just one last thing, another lesson to learn is that not only when I say that, the risk is doing too little, it's not just the initial dollar amount. It's making sure that it continues. So there's been a lot of work. Heather and her team at Equitable Growth have done a lot of great work on this about putting triggers in to make sure that the bills we pass this year continue into next year. There's a Democratic president next year and a Republican Congress. We do not want to have to renegotiate stuff we've already done. And no matter who controls the government, it is not a worthwhile use of their time to renegotiate things that we already agreed upon, as opposed to addressing the fallout from this crisis that we still don't know what it will be. And as we know, the government has huge checkpoints, and there's only so much that can get done in a certain amount of time. So the more things that we've already agreed to do can continue as they're needed, the much better it is for our politics. That wraps up my part.
Thanks, Mike. I think we're going to take Q&A, and Steph Sterling, were you going to moderate the Q&A?
First question that I see here, someone asked in the earlier whether we need to be raising revenue in order to afford these expenses.
Can you turn our video on?
So the question was, do we need to raise revenue?
Yes. Do we need to raise revenue in order to afford these costs?
Mike Consley, you should take that question. Or
No, you do not.
No, and I don't think so. And a few things. One is I don't think it's useful to bring into the conversation at this point. Nothing will be better about the situation. There's no worry that our ability to borrow or have money will be constrained by the long-term deficit or anything like that. To the extent it would ever exist, it's a political constraint, but that's a result of people having bad economic ideas, not about things that are true about the world. I think, there's no reason to slow down the economy with higher taxation, or to be thinking in terms of like, well, if we don't do this, it's going to constrain our ability to fight the coronavirus and recession. Absolutely, by far, ensuring that people can get back to work and the recovery is quick and swift will do more to heal our balance sheet and keep our debt to GDP in line in the long term than whether or not we try to slow down and try to think prudently about this or that decision. Having a sufficient recovery really will be the thing that ensures that we have the growth, which is really what we want, to be able to make any kind of debt payments that we need.
Can I will just add that I agree with everything Mike just said. I don't think we should be talking about revenue to pay for any of this stuff right now. That's just so outside the bounds of what we should be talking about. At some point in the future, we should be talking about how to restructure our tax code to fix some of the underlying problems that it exacerbates in terms of income inequality and wealth concentration at the top. I don't think that's necessarily something we have to do right now, and I don't want to muddy the waters between using the rebalancing of the tax code and the pay-fors. Like, I don't think we don't want to confuse anyone around that. In the future, it's worth understanding how a tax code that supercharged inequality has made us more vulnerable to a crisis like this.
Great. Another question I see here that I think other people have reflected. Can you speak to the trade-offs between targeted cash support to meet people's needs versus universal cash support in this moment? And could you also speak to the relationship between cash and other kinds of income and social supports?
Let me take a first cut at that, and then I'm sure other folks can weigh in. I think it's really important to note a couple things. I mean, one, we have systems that can effectively provide income support to those who've been directly affected. We have an unemployment insurance system that we could ramp up. We could replace people's salary at 100%. The Department of Labor also has a furlough program, which could allow people to be furloughed rather than fully laid off, which they're elevating on their website right now at the Department of Labor, but not every state has adopted. There's also work sharing programs where firms could cut people's hours and allow them to get unemployment benefits for that missing time. Those benefits are absolutely critical because those go out week by week. So those people that are hit the hardest they need that sustained income support that replaces their lost earnings. It is imperative that we help those that have been directly hurt. It's imperative for those families. It's imperative for their communities, and it's imperative for the economy. Other things like cash also are good ideas to do in an economic downturn, but those are going to be distributed across folks that have been directly affected and folks that haven't been directly affected. So that both reduces the bang for the buck of what the government is doing. And it also means that if we don't pair that with fully funding and extending unemployment insurance benefits, and again, I would argue we need to get as close to 100% of wage replacement as possible. If we don't pair it with that, then those folks that are the hardest hit are going to get, maybe they'll get $1,000 or $2,000 check. And maybe if progressive ideas pull forward, they would get that every quarter. And that's great. And it's better than nothing, but they won't be made whole. So we really need to make sure that we do that. The other thing is we need to make sure that those who are out of work, who've actually been laid off, get access to health insurance. We need to be covering people's COBRA payments or making sure that they can get on their state Medicaid or the like, because these are big expenses that families are going to have, and it's a health crisis. We need to make sure that no one is afraid to go to the doctor at this moment. So I hope that answers the question, that these are all important steps, but we do need to focus on making sure that we cover those and make whole those that have been hit the hardest.
I'll add that, I think Senator McConnell put out a plan yesterday that has cash assistance, that actually has less cash assistance for lower income people, or people who get laid off, or people who don't have taxable income, which, we're sort of having a debate on the left about whether we should do universal cash assistance or we should phase it out at the top. And conservatives are out there being like, let's give less to the people who need it, who actually need it. And we should all agree that they are the ones who, both morally but also economically, that's where the help needs to go. So I don't want us to get too deep in the weeds on whether we should phase it out at the top or not. We have to make sure that the most help goes to people who are directly affected by that, and that's people with low income, low wages, precarious job situations, people who've been laid off and having their hours reduced. That's really where
I'll add just very quickly. You can think about it in kind of like three ways, right? There's social insurance, which is insurance against lost wages. That's unemployment insurance. So people need to be made whole. People who just don't have income to be secure, people who are disabled, people who were already unemployed under our previous system, people who are students or caregivers. They need support as well. And also it is a good idea to bring that support up broadly, because everyone will be feeling this crunch. When people say targeted about the universal cash thing, I don't think that's a useful conversation, because it's like, oh, well, we should primarily give it to poor people, or we should primarily give it to people who already made, that's kind of a Democratic response, or we should make it so that it only goes to wage earners, which is the McConnell conservative response. It should go to everyone, and then also separately, we should make people whole. They're both important things. Automatically sending out checks is a really important macro stabilization tool, but it doesn't necessarily help individual people. So I think there's a yes and here thing we really want to emphasize. Maybe in different times there's a real trade-off here, but there is not one in this crisis.
Well, and just to make this real to the folks on the call, I'm going to go out on a limb and ask everyone on the call to think about their own circumstances. I know for us in my family, we're both telecommuting. We've not seen a loss in income. We've seen a loss in our ability to spend. So additional checks aren't going to necessarily get that bang for the economy. Whereas I'm living in a neighborhood where every small business is shut down. Those people need money in order to maintain their standard of living and to help my community. So just making it that I think can help us think about the role of social insurance versus the checks, both of them being important in a downturn.
There are remarkable and great questions here. I am seeing a number of them that focus on, for our last question here, what is the likelihood of action at this scale, and what can we do?
What can you do? Meaning
What can people do in this moment to try to affect an outcome that is as close as possible to these proposals here?
Well, I think to answer the first part of the question, I think action is very likely. There's no libertarians in a crisis, and we're seeing that. People who 10 years ago were talking about expansionary austerity seem to have gone silent on that point. So I think it's very, very likely that there will be large-scale action taken by the federal government. That said, the second part of the question is really, really important, because I'm not convinced that action will either be particularly smart and I'm very concerned that what it won't do is make us stronger in the long run. And we really have to focus our attention on our leaders, that they are not just thinking about, they absolutely have to think about this immediate moment, but the connection between this immediate moment and the longer scope of how we got here and where we're going are very intertwined. And I think if we don't force our lawmakers to think about those things, they probably won't.
I just want to echo what Michael has said. So, I mean, and this has been said by all three of us in various ways. It cannot be emphasized enough that this crisis in the United States this health crisis is being exacerbated into this dramatic economic crisis because we don't have things like universal health insurance. We haven't made sure that everybody had the right to stay home if they were sick or a loved one was sick. We don't have robust social insurance to help those first people that were laid off. As I noted before, only a quarter of people who are unemployed were getting, on average, are getting unemployment insurance. And so those structural factors are going to amplify the situation here in the United States, and making sure that we keep that at the front of how we think and talk about this moving forward, that this isn't just, this is showing us all that you actually can't have an economy unless you first ensure that people are healthy and can get to work and engage in the economy. And that's an idea that too many have not put front and center in our economic policy for far too long. So we need to focus on making sure that the humans can engage in the economy, and all the things that progressives have been talking about, childcare, paid sick days, all the like. These are fundamentally and profoundly economic issues, and this crisis is underscoring this. So what I hope is that we see this and don't think of this like the last crisis, which was about banks. Banks are going to fail. We're going to have all those problems, but fundamentally, we need to recognize that our economy is grounded in humans engaging with the world, and we need to start there. So,
everybody, this is Felicia again, and I would just like to thank Mike, Michael, and Heather for putting so much thought into such a comprehensive presentation that was designed to explain what was going on and to suggest a path forward. I take a few headlines away from this conversation, which is only at the beginning, of course, of conversations that we'll all be having together as progressives. But my three big headlines are, first, that we are currently facing an enormous health problem and an enormous economic problem, and that the scarring of unemployment, of business closures could last for years. We have to act now to forestall the worst of this, and we can afford to do so. So that's headline one. Headline two is that this is really a multi-front war. We are all fighting different pieces of this in different ways, but we have to remember that, yes, this is about health needs. It is also absolutely about immediate cash. It is about support to workers, about more paid sick, about more unemployment insurance. It is about providing money to states and cities, which are front lines in this fight. And it's about preventing business collapse with loans and other kinds of backstops. All of this needs to put workers and worker power first. And that gets me to my final wrap up, which is that this really, the reason we need so much is because this crisis reveals the fragility and the brokenness of our entire system. And as we encourage our lawmakers to promote relief, we also have to ensure that we are laying the tracks for real structural recovery. We need to remember that our work here has to focus on the sustained and the structural, not the targeted and the temporary. So with that, I would just like to thank Mike, Heather, Michael, and most importantly, all 170 some odd of you for joining us. We will get the slides out to folks, and we will continue to be in conversation about what we need to do to make this all better. Thank you.
Thank you, Felicia.
Thanks to
Thank
folks
you,
at Roosevelt
everybody.
for setting it up and running it.
Yeah.
Oh yes, for sure. Thanks to the Roosevelt team for making this happen. Thank you.